Hello and welcome to the LinuxRecruit website and our first instalment of a series of videos aimed at the DevOps community. I'm Tony Chapman. Today I'm joined by Grant Smith, DevOps pioneer, regular speaker on the London Meetup circuit and now writer of book Next Gen DevOps, which we'll be discussing today. For those of you unfortunate enough not to know Grant, his career has been an extraordinary journey, starting as a system admin at AOL, before moving into a senior operational capacity. Grant followed this up by revolutionising the live site operations for online gaming organisation Playfish, and most recently created a collaborative DevOps team at British Gas Connected Homes, delivering a large-scale, high-performance Internet of Things platform. Today he'll be talking us through the Next Gen DevOps book. So, the first natural first question would be why, and I guess why now?
So, the why is really it's one part frustration and one part desire to contribute. In that, I've spent the last 15 years running ops teams at various levels of scale in various different sizes of business, and I and my colleagues in dev as well, we've been frustrated by what we've been able to achieve. It's always felt like there was a great idea, we had talent, we had time, and yet we didn't quite fulfill our expectations. And over the years, I've seen a pattern emerge as to those projects that didn't quite hit the mark. And that really started to build in me as my time in EA at Playfish came to an end. And on the other side of it, I've had a great time in IT. Right? I was not that great at anything else in school, to be honest. And the IT industry has been an awesome place to work, and it felt like there was something I could contribute. And a book seemed the right way to address that contribution. I've got this idea of a pattern, I've got a hypothesis, I think, as to why we're not able to build the services to the level and the standard we expect from ourselves. And so it seemed like the ideal play to do it. Write the book, create a framework, get people talking, hopefully.
So what's the general premise of the book?
Generally speaking, so it can be stated as, if you look at most IT departments, and I've worked in a few and I've got friends in others, and I talk a lot to people in IT. IT departments are structured today pretty much the way they have been for the last 50 years. We've got separate development departments, separate operations teams, separate testing departments, they get hired at different times, and that's been a pattern for a long time now. And yet look at the developments that have happened in the last 10 years, just the last 10 years. You know, we've got the agile movement coming in and shrinking our projects down and bringing closer our expectations so we don't get the scope creep and things that we used to have. We've got cloud computing becoming now, an everyday service. We've got DevOps being discussed. People are now expecting online services. The industry has changed from building packaged goods that it used to do 10 plus years ago to now almost exclusively producing services. And yet we still work in the same sorts of rigid structures we used to work in 50, 60 years ago. So we expect radically different results, and yet we're not changing how we do things.
So a lot of it is about changing mindset, breaking down barriers.
It's about, my approach is to say, if you're building an online service, what skills do you need to build that thing, launch it, and manage it through its life? And then how would you structure a team to use those skills to build that service? Effectively, boiled down to a nutshell, that's what got me started on this. I'm in EA, I'm watching online games being built and looking at the structures that are being put in place to run those games, and I'm seeing a big disparity between the skills that are needed to build, launch and manage and the skills that get applied at each of those times and those places. Roll that forward, and I saw similar sorts of patterns at British Gas, and we addressed some of those issues. Playfish certainly had some problems with that. Again, we made some inroads to this, and this framework is really what I've learned from those places, and roll that forward to, if you were either doing this from scratch and trying to build an online service, how would you build that team? Or even if you're in a business already, you're looking to transition to building online services, what are the changes you need to do? Because if you think you can just do the same thing you did when you were building small package software or small applications to running an online service, you're mistaken, it won't work.
So you talk about 3 core philosophies within the framework. Can you talk us through
that? So the 3 major pillars that this is all based on is product first. What is the service you're building? What does it need to do? The second pillar is, if you're going to build a service, it's going to be consumed by potentially anybody on any number of devices, anywhere in the world potentially, you need to know that this is going to work. You can't just trust to luck. And that means testing must be built in right from day one. This isn't something you bolt on at the end. This isn't something you open to the lowest bidder. This is something you need to be able to verify right from day one how your application behaves in various different scenarios. And you're going to build this thing potentially many times a day. That means you need to be verifying its behavior many times a day. And the third pillar is about skills. And the point here is, if you're building an online service, you're going to need a variety of different skills. You're going to need some developers, you're going to need some operations skills, you're going to need some network engineering, network security, all manner of different skills. If you need those skills, the skills are more important than the roles. And the skills are there to build this product. So really, if you look at those three things, what do you get to? Well, you get to the idea of, I'm building an online service, I need a team suitable to build, launch it, and manage that service throughout its life cycle. And I need to be verifying that that service is behaving the way I expect all the time. And none of those things are afterthoughts, they're all forethoughts.
So you're building silos within products rather than...
Yeah, which is not a new approach, right? I mean, the divisional org structure has been with us at least 20, 30 years. And certainly, you know, you look at the FTSE 500 and most of those companies are divisional. You know, there are product divisions. You look at a bank and you're going to have credit divisions and you're going to have online service divisions and that kind of stuff. But if you look at an IT department, boom, development, operations, testing. We don't do it by product. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, there's a lot of senses that products might fail, they might be transient, and also the idea that you would have an entire team for one product probably isn't practical. But there are ways of doing this, right? You look at everything we use in IT as a product. You know, if you consider building any online service, you're going to be using source control systems, you're going to be using hopefully automated test harnesses, you're going to have artifact repositories, you're going to need configuration management systems. All of these things I've just listed are products as well. Who owns the budget for those? Who's the stakeholder for those? Who are the teams owning and supporting those things? If you look in our IT departments, we actually develop and use a lot of online services and a lot of products. Now, if you think about it in that way, suddenly now, a product team owning several products and seeing them through their product life cycle is now a lot less transient than taking a new product in and building it and seeing if it works. Because if you have that sort of scenario and a product looks like it's not doing so well, you now don't have a whole team that you don't know what to do with. They now actually have a whole variety of other services they're still providing for the rest of their peers in the IT organisation.
Okay.
So it's very much a product focus.
Product focus. And what barriers have you seen to try and implement this philosophy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Every time I talk about this stuff at events and conferences, I get a lot of nodding heads and I get a lot of agreement. I always feel like I'm preaching to the choir at those sorts of events. And when I was at EA and trying to suggest this approach within EA, I'd get the same sort of feeling. You talk to the engineers, you talk to the people actually building these things and responsible for these things, and there's a lot of nodding heads and yeah, this is a great idea, we should consider something like this. You bring that up to the leadership level, you start discussing it there, and when you start from the abstract, like I have with this conversation, you know, product focus and building our teams and that kind of stuff, a lot of nodding heads, and then you start going, okay, let's think about how we might transition to this stuff. Suddenly everybody backs away, and there's a lot of concern. I've actually had people say to me, we've never done it this way. I mean, I didn't think I'd hear that in this decade, right? I mean, you know, change is everywhere in IT. We've never done it this way. And then, oh no, we can't change. We might confuse our people, the very people who completely support and back this up. When I've been in organisations that are maybe a bit newer, and we've talked about how might we structure ourselves, there's often a feeling that, oh, restructures never work, or restructures just take up time and they don't actually achieve anything. And all I'm ever saying is, just start from the product, start from the thing you're trying to build, start from the thing that you're trying to make money from, or you're trying to promote, or you're trying to make a big deal. How would you do that? What team would you use? What service would you use? Think about it from that perspective. So what I tend to get is a lot of agreement, and then at the last minute, I think it's either fear of a new thing, fear of trying something in a different way. I also think there's different levels of understandings of the different functions. So if you go into most IT departments and you look at the CIOs or CTOs in those organisations, they tend to understand one discipline of IT quite well. You know, they've either come up through the ranks or what have you. And they tend to be a little hazier on the other disciplines. And I think they struggle to see the other disciplines as equally important. Traditionally, most of the places I've been, the CTOs have come from a development background, and most of the people in an IT organisation are developers. They're the largest single group, and there's a lot of focus on them. And the other disciplines seem to be considered sort of afterwards. Whereas if you think about an online service, building the thing in the first place is a small part of the challenge compared to something that might run for years. And if you looked at a playfish game, a typical playfish game would be in development for a year, 18 months, but might live for 3 years after that.
Right.
Look at it from that perspective, and the service is, in theory, twice as important. If you think about it during the development process, it makes no revenue. It's only a cost. Once you put it live, it's now revenue generating and hopefully profit generating. That is a much more important time. So again, I try to convince leadership, think about it from a service perspective.
Yeah, so a lot of it is educating the senior leaders. Okay, and then obviously getting them to commit when it actually, the practicalities become
and that's why I published or decided I'd write and publish a book, because I felt that to make progress with these leaders, I needed to present them with a framework, something they could consider simply, look at in an abstract sense, and get a sense of whether it made sense to them just from the abstract position, right? So as a thought experiment, could they perceive this framework and understand it? Similar to the way that, ITIL has a framework, Prince 2 has a framework, ISO 9000, there are various frameworks for those kinds of things. And even Agile Development has a framework you can understand. And I thought, well, if we're trying to revolutionize how we run services, I should have a framework. But I can't jump straight to a framework because I know that in our industry, quite rightly, everybody questions everything. So what I decided to do was, there will be a framework, but the book then takes the reader on a journey, how I came to various conclusions, what I saw, what my experiences were, the hypothesis I formed, the tests I've put in place, and the conclusion I've reached.
So was there quite a lot of historical research that went into...
Yeah, that was...
That's time consuming.
That's what nearly broke me the first time I tried writing this book. So when I left EA, I pretty much got started on it, and I wrote the chapters in order. I'm not sure whether that was the right thing to do or not, and now I look back on it. But the third chapter is really a study of the history of the IT industry. It isn't the history of computers. It's not about the electrical engineering and all the rest of it. It's not about the study of development and programming languages. It's literally the study of computing as a business and how it's operated. Now, there's not a lot written on that. You end up having to scour through photostatic documents and looking for one salient paragraph and trying not to take it out of context and that kind of stuff. And I'm not naturally a researcher. That's not something I'm trained in. It was hard. It was really, really tough.
Did you find anything surprising?
Yeah, really, really surprising stuff. Something that's not in the book, but certainly something I'm going to write an article about later is, did you know that percentage-wise there's less women in IT now than there ever has been?
Interesting.
Yeah, so I went right back to the very early days, the 40s and 50s, when the computer industry was really starting out just after the Second World War. And if you look at photographs of those early teams that built the very first computers, they're at least 50% women. Obviously, we've just had a war, a lot of people died, a lot of people serving, etc. That's understandable. I found some census information from the US in 1970, which was the first year that computer operator was a profession in the US Census. And something like 30% of computer operators were women in 1970. And then I found some graduate stats from computer science degrees. I think it was 82, and it was graduate stats across the whole of America. And something like 16% of people graduating from computer science classes were women. And then I roll my experience forward to when I started in the industry in the early to mid 90s, mid to late 90s and the year 2000 and beyond. And I'm not seeing 16% women in this industry, vastly smaller numbers of women around. And so that was an interesting discovery in itself, not strictly relevant to next-gen DevOps, but certainly was an interesting thing. I also found a lot of interesting things that helped me form hypotheses about how we got where we're going. So something that I don't know if it's well known, but when computers started to be sold commercially, it was quite normal that a company would buy a computer and the software it needed from the same company. So if you're buying a Univac machine and you're buying it for payroll purposes, Univac would write you a payroll software to do your thing. Now obviously they're using standard components they developed inside, but they're supplying you the computer and the software with it. So you didn't need developers. The first computer people you would hire were operations people to run and manage the computer.
Sure.
Developers came later. So when organizations started building their own applications, they already had computers, they already had operations departments that had fairly standardized roles. The computer company would tell this operations department what they had to do. So if you bought a Univac, they did these sorts of things. If you bought an IBM, they would do another set of things. And then when they started developing their own applications, they naturally hired developers into their own little team. And this is where the silos started.
Sure.
Because computer operations was very much decided by the computer manufacturer, and then your development departments were using languages provided by the computer manufacturer. I mean, back then, often assembly type languages, but the point is that's where the silos started. And when you consider that, why do we still have them?
From your research, when did DevOps, as we know it today, when did that start to gradually...
So I think that's a really interesting question in a lot of ways, because DevOps as a term is very recent. I think 2009 were the first DevOps days. But actually, I trace its origins right back to Agile development. I got involved in my first Agile development projects back in 2003, 2004 in AOL. And I was running an ops team then. I was good friends with the test team manager. And the development department had decided they were going Agile. And they had been allowed to, had contractors and consultants hired in to help them do Agile. We had ThoughtWorks come in, teach Agile to the developers. But actually in operations and testing, we were kind of ignored. We were sort of left on our own, and we were trying to struggle with the idea of how do we work in an Agile way. You know, I'm running continuous integration systems, and back then they went wrong all the time. Like I had 10 times more continuous integration problems than I had live service incidents. You know, and I'm struggling to figure out how do I do this stuff. And we did a lot of research online, and we found some people who had written a few posts on various Usenet forums and stuff talking about agile operations and extreme operations and all this kind of stuff. And I think I look back to those early practices that were talked about there, and they are the foundation of some of those DevOps practices. The idea that you code infrastructure, that code has to go in a source control, that it's managed by a team, not single individuals, you know, in silos and stuff. And I think the early development of DevOps came from some of that agile development, applying those principles into operations teams. I think what the DevOps movement did was really make a great noise and picked a good time for saying, actually, we in operations, we need to learn from development in a lot of places, and we need to take a much more formal approach to some of the things we're doing if we're going to make them repeatable and successful. So I think that the roots of DevOps lie in the Agile movement, and everything I think that I've done in the book is to try and build on what's gone before. So I'm building on the Agile movement and what we've learned from them, building on the opportunities presented by cloud computing, building on the discussion, you know, the DevOps discussion, the big impact it's had is on an explosion of tooling. In operations, for decades, we've been writing our own tools and labouring in isolation in our businesses and having to build our own custom components, you know, unless we work for a bank and we're buying big commercial off-the-shelf tools. Now, though, you go onto GitHub and there's 13 different monitoring systems and 15 different configuration management systems, and you get a lot of opportunity to use other people's things, which means you don't have to start everything from scratch. So I think the DevOps movement's done a great job of making some of those tools.
Okay. Is that part of the reason behind the name Next Gen DevOps?
Yeah, I wanted to tip my hat to the DevOps movement. Those guys have done a great job, and I'm not going to stand here and try and define a definition of a movement that I didn't start. And so, but I did want to provide a definition. I did want to provide a framework. So I think DevOps is great. I'm happy with what it's done so far. I'm looking at what happens next, and so it seemed logical for me to call this Next Generation DevOps. I think it's extending the processes or the discussion that DevOps has had to the provision of all of the services we use and build. Okay,
so what do you see for the future of DevOps? What does DevOps look like in 2020, for instance?
Yeah, so I think the future of DevOps is the future of IT, and the future of IT is an acknowledgement that we build services, that will live for years, that we build services that will be used by people all across the world 24 hours a day, and that everybody is our customer. And I think that means the industry as a whole has to mature. The operations discipline itself has to mature. I think that in 20 years' time, you won't get operations engineers that learn this trade in their bedroom, or at least I certainly hope you don't. You know, we have a formal degree course for development. We don't have a formal degree course for network engineering, for operations engineering, for IT security or network security. Do we need one? I don't know, but we certainly need more formality in those things. We need more application of the scientific method. We need more formal engineering in those professions, particularly if IT is going to deliver on its promise.
Okay. You gave me an example last time we met about not being able to find good junior operational guys coming through the ranks purely because of the computer science.
Yeah,
towards developers?
Several times over the last decade or so, I've been in a position to look to hire young people, graduates, etc., to try and avoid those guys who've got all the bad habits already. Maybe make an operations person the way I think they should be guided. And I've really struggled. The youngest person I've been able to get hold of is sort of already 25 years old, already got a degree of some sort or another, already been in the industry 5 years, and I'm really struggling to, and not that they already had tons of bad habits, but I'm struggling to find those young people. And the big concern I have is, how would you get into this gig? So when I was at uni and I was interested in Linux, I bought a Linux Unleashed book and I had to install Slackware 4, and that means work. I had to understand and learn a whole bunch of new stuff. You want to do that today? You stick the CD in, it just works. You don't even have to install it, it'll run straight from the CD. You want to run Apache? It actually probably already is running if you've got some sort of Red Hat CD. You didn't have to do anything. You want a nice pretty desktop? They all come with that already. So it's very difficult for a new person to sort of really get to grips with this. How do they learn? I had to work my bum off to get a game working on DOS. I had to clear memory and all sorts of other things. You don't do that anymore. So if you're an ops person, or if you're somebody who doesn't necessarily want to be a developer but is interested in IT, where do you go to learn? You stick your games in, they just work. You want to install Linux, it just works. All this stuff is fairly ubiquitous. You want to make, you want to read an Apple file on a PC, well, the software's going to be there for you. It's already going to work, right? So it's very difficult to learn in your bedroom now.
So how do we go about tackling that issue?
I think there's two or three things I want to do at the same time. Everywhere I go, I try and see if we can figure out some sort of graduate program. I find that really difficult in the UK. In the US, they seem much more willing and able to do graduate programs. In the UK, I've really struggled to get any traction on that, but that's something I definitely want to do. People fresh out of computer science who are interested in things beyond merely development, I think there's an approach there. Or actually any graduate course. By training, I'm a civil engineer. Engineering is a great basis for some of the stuff that we need to do. So I think some sort of postgrad training. I also think there needs to be some sort of discussion in academia about the gap that exists at the moment between electrical engineering and computer science. What's in between that now? We've got whole operating system layers and whole abstraction layers in between these things, and I think there needs to be some discussion about how do we get people from designing silicon and processors to all the way at the other end where we've got people writing software that runs 2 or 3 levels abstracted from that. What's in between? So I think there needs to be a discussion in academia there. And then I think there needs to be some real discussion in IT itself about what do we need from people? Are we being serviced well by the people who come out of academia? Are they the right things we need? I've got a lot of respect for the computer science course, and there's a lot that it covers that is worthy. But is that the only course we need? And I think IT itself has a duty there. You look at Gartner, Accenture, people like that, and for a decade now they've been publishing reports to say there's going to be a skills shortage. I know you're experiencing exactly that right now, right?
Unfortunately so, yeah.
There's a massive shortage between what industry needs and what's available. That's great for people like me because I can negotiate better rates, but it's not necessarily great for the IT industry if we want to grow. And we have to look at what's the solution for that stuff. I know that a decade ago, one of the approaches to that was offshoring. It was obviously to reduce costs, but it was also to make more skills available. That works in certain situations, it doesn't work in all of them.
I'd probably say part of the skills shortage within DevOps is maybe self-generated as well, with people not really having a clear definition of what they require. I think you mentioned last time we met again about the people saying they want DevOps, but they're actually looking for a sysadmin.
Yeah. I think one of the failures of the DevOps movement, it's a bit harsh, like I said, those guys have done some great work, but one of the failures is they haven't created a formal definition of it. I think one of the big successes of the Agile movement was a nice, concise definition. That's where they started from. Well, maybe it's not where they started, but that was their public introduction, right? You could go read the Agile Manifesto, you can see it even today, see all the people who signed it, see what it's about. You can buy Martin Fowler's book or all of the other books if you want, but there was your initial definition. And DevOps hasn't done that. And again, I think if you're going to appeal to leadership, you need to start from a nice, easy to consume definition. If you're introducing a new concept, you need to get people to have a definition they can refer to. They can understand the implications of. So what I'm experiencing right now is a lot of people are saying DevOps, thinking it's just another word for sysadmin. Again, it's a profession we've changed the title of. It used to be computer operator. I've been called a system engineer, a sysadmin, software programming engineer, all manner of different things. We don't have a lot of standardization in the discipline of operations. And so I think a lot of people think DevOps engineer is just what we call those guys now. But actually, as you know, the people who consider themselves capable of operating by DevOps standards, they're not just a sysadmin. They look down on sysadmins, not in a sort of negative way, but as in a place where they've come from, and they're moving somewhere else. Or actually, a lot of the DevOps guys I know are former developers who are interested in systems, and so they've actually come from another direction. So you've got several people coming into this thing, heading towards what I think is a central point, which is more formal development in operations, more repeatable processes, more formalized methods, things like that, using standard tools and things. That's sort of where DevOps is going, but that's not a formal definition.
Do you try and tackle that issue in the book as well? Tackle the formal definition?
So this is the whole idea. Next-gen DevOps is a framework with a formal definition and guiding principles. That's my start point. The book is an explanation of how I got there, but the framework is the important point. And again, the reference to next-gen DevOps is, like I say, a hat tip to the DevOps movement, but also acknowledgement that it's not my place to define DevOps. I didn't create it, it's not my first concept, but next-gen DevOps is my thing, and that has a formal definition. And that is, as we discussed earlier, it's about a product focus, a recognition that the skills for the product are what's important, and embedding testing right from day one as the most important thing.
Okay, so what's next for next-gen DevOps?
So next is, the book will be published in a few weeks. The framework will follow shortly after that. I've got a series of opportunities to talk to a variety of different companies about what this might mean and the implications of that, and me looking to try and promote discussion in the IT industry about how we build online services and the next generation of products and services that we need from IT.
Okay, and the book's available?
On Amazon, priced at $15.99.
Okay. It's a bargain.
It's an absolute bargain for the indispensable guide to writing and publishing online services in the 21st century.
Excellent. So 3 weeks time on Amazon, $15.99.
That's the way to get it.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Grant.
Thank you.